Welcome to the Inside Track, where we talk about some of the major events of the day and the issues that underlie our political discourse.
Well, welcome, and today we're going to be looking at party conferences, one of the stranger parts of the political calendar, very much fixed. Havard, perhaps you'd like to shed light as a stalwart who's been to many a party conference.
Hot foot from the conferences. I'm a bit of a veteran. I think my first conference was something like 1991, which is sort of getting on for quite a while ago now. That they have their own air party conferences, and it's not just the sea air, which is where they were historically held. They mostly took place in the big old seaside resorts because you need a lot of accommodation for delegates and for the attendees at the conferences. But they have a real different culture to them depending on the political party, because the party conference has a slightly different role in each different political party in the way it works constitutionally, but also the way it works as as sort of an element that bonds that party together and builds the culture of the organisation.
Let's look more fundamentally at why the parties hold them, because that's very different in each case.
There are two main reasons why parties hold conferences, and firstly is the constitutional reason, which is ostensibly why all the parties hold conferences. But the biggest reason these days is the solid tug of cash. The conference is a major fundraising effort for the political parties, as if you've ever tried to book an event at party conference, you will realise, because the costs can be quite astronomical. There was certainly some chuntering at the most recent conference, the end of the conference season's session that the Conservatives had in Birmingham, that there were very high prices for being charged for some of the rooms, and yet not a single glass of wine seemed to be being dispensed to some of the delegates who perhaps were arriving slightly later.
And it works a bit both ways, because conferences are actually also one of the biggest expenditures for the political party. You know, the thing is, they have to actually make a huge amount of money just to pay for the overheads to cover that. But at the same time, is it right, I think, that in opposition there can be a burden on a party when a party is in government? Lobbyists are queuing up to attend these things, and so they're very profitable for that party.
You see a very stark example of that in these last few weeks. So the Labour Party conference in Liverpool, where the Labour Party have deigned to hold a series of conferences, was very much oversubscribed. There were some 20,000 people there, and you don't have to take the Labour Party's word for it. It was actually quite difficult to get out of conference what you want to get out of conference, because just the slew of people everywhere. And that was quite something to see. As someone who attended the New Labour conferences of the Blair era, where you were also getting circa 20,000 people turning up. And then you go all the way through to the other end of the spectrum to, say, something like the Lib Dem conference, which historically has been one of the smaller ones of the main parties. And yet that was also very well attended this year. But the people attending aren't necessarily the same.
No, the feeling is very different. I mean, on the one hand, if you're going to a governing party's conference, you're going through very tight security, like an airport, but souped up even more so, and you've been vetted in advance and so on. Whereas if you go to some of the smaller parties, not just the Lib Dems, also the Greens, also Reform, there's a lot more of a vibe of very benevolent elderly volunteers who are doing their best to just have a look in your plastic bag to see there's nothing amiss there, and then waving you along.
That has changed this year. So certainly for all now the main established UK parties, you're going to go for airport security. And actually not just old-fashioned airport security, they've now updated the scanning technology. So they've probably got better scanners at the conferences than they have at the average British airport. The process was actually easier than it has been at any time since I've attended a government conference in the last 20 years, even at Labour. In fact, the Labour security was smoother than the security of the Conservatives.
And let's look at one of the fundamentals of why you'd go. I mean, for two types of people. One is, why would party members go? And why would outside interest groups go who aren't part of a political party?
I mean, there are all sorts of reasons we go to a conference. It's a bit like going to a football match for members. I mean, they say, politics is show business for ugly people. Well, I mean, party conference is
what does that say about us?
Party conference is the equivalent of the football match if you're in politics. And unless there's a by-election or something like that, where do you get to meet all your peers, far-flung friends, you meet at a party conference. And certainly for those in political consultancy, you really get that sense of the pack coming back together, because you meet all your fellow political consultants, the people who work for NGOs, the people who work for trade associations. We're all there. And because we're professionals, we all recognise each other, and we're going to be spending the best part of a month together, particularly for those who go to TUC Congress.
And that convening point is really important, because I think there are units within a political party that are very cohesive. So you go to Westminster, all the MPs get together. They're in one corridor a lot of the time in the division lobbies. Likewise, if you're in a Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly, but they often work quite separately. And so the one time of the year, or only 2 times of the year, when they all get together in the same area, really is conference. It's unique.
That's right. And particularly in the case of something like Wales, for example, where you've got a mountain range running halfway through the country. But even in the situation where you have a national conference, there is no other occasion that gets Conservative activists, campaigners, members, say from the north of Scotland, to come down to a particular place and then meet people from Suffolk, Cornwall. It's only the party conference that does that. We talked a bit about why parties have conferences. What we haven't perhaps talked about is the tribes of conference. And each conference used to have a very different air. And in some ways that's been sort of swamped by the professionalism. It's been swamped by the ever more exuberant trade stands you now get at conferences. They all start to look a bit more like each other. But you used to have a particular crowd of people. The sandal-wearing activist was a feature of the Liberal Democrat conference, and I don't think I saw anyone wearing sandals this year. This was a great disappointment to me. In the Labour Party conference, you'd always see half a dozen delegates wandering around with Lenin hats on. And again, I don't recall seeing a single person amongst the vast crowd at Labour who was dressed like a sort of a socialist of old.
The purges are complete.
The purges are complete. But I suspect the purge is actually it's carried a lot of these people off his old age, because up until the Cameron era, you always had the big, what they used to call the blue rinse crowd of the Conservatives, the sort of that generation from the Second World War, who were the stalwart Conservatives who ran those Conservative associations. And they were very, very present. And I can remember vividly when the Conservative Party held its first conference in Manchester, how many of these people were suddenly shocked to find they weren't at the seaside, which is where they'd historically been going. It wasn't from Didno or something like that. And also their rooms on Canal Street in Manchester seemed to have extra accoutrements about, for purposes that didn't seem related to attendance at party conference, shall we say. There was a bit of a cultural shock there, but those people have, I'm afraid, been carried off by time. That section of the Conservative Party no longer exists.
And I think there are noticeably more suits generally these days. Some of it is, young people used to go in jeans, they now sort of dress up for these kinds of things. Some people are there because they want a career in politics and they want to sort of eye up potential seats and potential collaborators. But there are also a lot of people who are just interested in the events. And I suppose the other thing is you have the volunteers who run a party at every level, who run the policy committees, who actually influence in different ways and have a behind-the-scenes role, who chair a local party, for instance. So they'll all absolutely be there. And it's very rare to find any other kind of gathering where you get all of them.
Very, very unusual. And that is a way, one of the tensions, I think, in the modern conference. So the tribes have gone, but what you have is you have got the commercial and the party. And that was very stark this year. The Conservatives were very few commercial guests there, although those of us who do plan for the long term were there, and there were a number of people from some of the professional organisations there for that purpose. The mainstream of the commercial lobbyists were to be found at the Labour Party conference this year. There were a few interlopers at the Liberal Democrats as well, but again, not very many. The majority of the people you had attending particular Labour were essentially people with a commercial interest, and it was very, very obvious.
We mainly talk about conference around the September-October kind of season, but there are other conferences as well as the main. They used to be a week long, they're now more like 3 or 4 days. But there's also a spring conference very often around March.
That's right.
Sometimes regional conferences and other conferences as well.
So the spring conferences, the regional conferences, now these can be very interesting for people who are interested in policy making. Because if you want to collar ministers, it's far easier to do that at the government party spring conference than it is at their autumn conference. So that's the sort of inside tip for viewers of this podcast. Whereas if you want to see how party conferences used to be, and perhaps go back to the roots of the party, then the regional conferences can be that.
It's also noticeable just because attendance at the spring conference is a lot lower amongst the activist space.
Right.
And these things are really expensive, so people can't always afford to spend a week at the seaside randomly. And if they pick and choose, they go for the autumn one. What that means is most of the people at the spring conference are usually ministers or shadow ministers and people who are actively engaged professionally in politics.
Oh, absolutely. And again, there's been a change in cost structure at conferences, the professionalisation of conferences, the move to the cities. It's changed the tone of the event, and there's less cheaper accommodation. And certainly I was seeing various people distressed on social media at the Conservative conference, having tried to book a really cheap room somewhere and then having discovered that perhaps the room didn't exist. Whereas if you were at Blackpool, there were incredibly cheap rooms that existed. And I can certainly remember one delegate managed to find something like sort of Harry Potter's room under the stairs. And, this suited perfectly for the conference, but it's a type of accommodation you won't find in Birmingham or Manchester. So it's that's, again, a real shift in terms of the way the conferences work.
It's noticeable also that the whole purpose of the conference has changed over time. I mean, I think less so for the Conservatives, but certainly in the case of Labour, there used to be a massive policy setting agenda role that was formal.
Yeah.
And now it's become much more, I think it started under the Blair era, where you began to move more towards these sort of sanitised policy documents saying we support or endorse these general principles, rather than we are writing every single letter of Labour Party policy.
I mean, you say that, but you go back to the Callaghan administration in particular, where he's remonstrated with the conference, and there was a lot more of that type of formal thing that you don't see so much. But Labour still have their delegates conference, they still have their policy motions, they're still voting against the government. And famously, of course, the Liberal Democrats do the same. And the policy motions are what influences party policy. Of course, as we saw from the coalition government, it doesn't necessarily matter, what ends up in government policy, but it does influence party policy.
And that's the thing with the smaller parties, not just the Lib Dems, but also something like the Greens. It's binding, it's party policy.
Yeah.
For the Labour Party, conference can frequently condemn stuff and vote overwhelmingly to denounce the government. Often doesn't make a blind bit of difference in terms of what goes on the floor of the hall. And Conservative conference, my sense has always been that, this is very much set piece speeches. This is a showpiece, but then that's not really the main conference event. The main bulk of the conference is what goes on in the background.
Well, indeed, and the Conservative fringe, the conference fringe, is very interesting to see. And the Conservative fringe also has another element to it, because almost you have the conference of the people who don't have that platform in the hall have been, in the last years, running their own conferences. Yeah. And that's very stark at the Conservatives. And even this year, you had somebody like Liz Truss coming to the party conference and getting a huge turnout. And it wasn't just a room full of journalists. There were a lot of activists who were quite keen to hear from Liz Truss as someone who they felt had a message that, how should we say, the establishment had somehow contrived to undermine. And there was certainly an element of that sort of conspiratorial type of politics.
It resonated in certain corners.
Yeah, it has a very strong resonance in certain corners. But you have a sort of a difference in approach in terms of the way the parties work. But I think the key thing of the Conservative Party, why it is the outlier in all of these, is the Hague reforms of the 90s were there to professionalise the Conservative Party and stop all this awful talk about even the European Union. And how counterproductive it actually turned out to be, because essentially you can suppress a conversation amongst delegates in the hall, but you can't stop it. And if you don't do what, say, Lib Dems and the Labour Party do, is to have that pressure vessel, to have that release, having the motions, you then bottle it up somewhere else.
And that's very noticeable in the effect that the conference has and the effect the fringe has, because if you speak to delegates coming back from a conference, it occasionally happens, but it's really rare for them to come back and say, wow, we had a really great debate in the main hall with thousands of us, and we had some fascinating speeches and very nuanced, positive, constructive outcomes. No, what they usually say is, I went to a really good fringe meeting. The debates in the main hall were bland, and they were mainly orchestrated for media coverage, but the packed fringe events, and of course, these are held often in quite small rooms, so even the room with just 50 people can feel packed if it's a tiny broom cupboard. And the bigger ones will have 300 or even 900 people in a room, sweating away because they want to hear some really, really interesting things. And often they're a bit edgy, they're a bit outside the political mainstream, and they're agenda setting. And that is where I think hearts and minds are won in conference amongst the activist space. And certainly I've seen organisations book whole programs of events where they go for a sort of theme and they hammer away at different elements of it.
And certainly that's perhaps one of the reasons why third parties, those who aren't part of these political tribes, come and do conference events, to try and set the agenda, and that can be more or less successful, and depending on the way it's deployed. And in some cases, you have say, the move between the European Union, that was very successful at deploying this, particularly through the Conservative Party. And in the Labour movement, you have trade unions, and they often have fringes that they sponsor or inspire, and they in recent years have been substantially less effective at driving the agenda and driving government policy. But that is one of the primary reasons people hold these events.
And it's very noticeable that some of these things are done very effectively and some of them are done very clumsily. I can easily spot a mile off, for example, a standards pitch that, say, a lobbying firm or a think tank does to all three party conferences. They feel, well, we're obligated to give equal coverage, so we're doing this. And you can tell their heart really isn't in it.
Yes.
And the delegates can feel that. And there's, I think, limited engagement as a result.
Well,
whereas
limited turnout as well. You can
absolutely
see quite a stark difference. It's actually, if you follow policy areas as we do as a consultancy, you can get a very stark difference in turnouts for different party conferences. And it's also really interesting the different issues that are raised. So, for example, you have housing fringe at, say, the Liberal Democrat and the Labour conference. Most of the questions will tend to be about housing. And that's also true to some extent for the Conservatives. But there'll be a much more bigger financial element of the Conservatives, much more focus on the funding, much more focus on the economics and the overall picture of housing, and less focus on perhaps people who are individually needing housing. And that's just a microcosm of it. You see that on a whole panoply of different issues.
And that's the thing, the fringe meetings that really connect with the audience have a feel for how the respective traditions of the parties go. And that's not just one size fits all for the Conservatives, for Labour. It's actually realising those different tribes, those different strands of opinion.
Absolutely. I mean, it wouldn't be a Liberal Democrat conference if you didn't go to the Electoral Reform Society's fringe, for example. And that has a certain sort of ambience all of its own. You can expect people to raise particularly technical questions at that about electoral systems and how they work, whereas you might have a similar fringe, say, at the Conservative Party conference and the Labour conference, and it'd be met from a very different perspective. The Labour Party often looks at electoral reform from the point of view of keeping centre-left views dominant in sort of political life, and the Conservative Party often looks at it from, again, a position of ensuring conservative viewpoints are brought forward. There's less of that focus on the granular detail of voting systems and STV and all the sort of baggage that tends to come with discussion of electoral reform with the Lib Dems.
And as a hardened conference veteran of over 30 years, I mean, what's your sense of the respective cultures of the different conferences you've been to? How do they feel?
Well, this year has been particularly interesting. The main sort of things that impact the feel of the conference are: how is the party doing in public presence? Have they won a by-election recently? Are they in government? Is government going well? That type of thing. And certainly, I mean, when a party wins a general election, usually you can expect a conference where people are very ebullient, sort of bouncing off the walls. Well, that wasn't how it was at Labour this year. There was very much a sense of the weight of government was on their shoulders, and they had a very negative media background, which impacted the conference and certainly impacted the tone of it. I mean, under the surface, people were pretty happy, but there was a certain sense of urgency and sense of sort of dourness about the conference, which is slightly odd in a way. Whereas if you wanted bouncing off the walls, that was this year's Reform conference. The Lib Dem conference was also particularly perky. The Lib Dems well thought to have overperformed, and certainly they overperformed their position in the opinion polls. And so there was a lot of very happy people at the Liberal Democrats. And perhaps the strangest of all was the Conservatives, because you'd think the Conservatives would be in a state of absolute despair, having lost one of the biggest electoral turnovers, I think, in the party's history, the second worst result for the Conservatives ever since going back to the early 19th century. And you'd think that people would be dressed in black and there would be some sort of wake for the Conservative Party, but nothing of the sort. In fact, there was a real sense that the Conservative Party could be back in office. And however, you might think that might be slightly delusional, but there was a real sense that the Labour Party didn't have the grip on government that people thought Labour would have.
And I can't think of a single time when one or more of the parties hasn't been thinking about having a total rethink of conference because of the huge cost of setting up the conference and running it and attending it. And yet they seem to always come back to this exact model. Do you see conferences very much as being here to stay?
I think so. And if you look at, say, some of the newer political parties coming on the scene, like Reform is doing their conference very much like a Liberal Democrat conference. I mean, it's like a strange combination to the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives. So very much sort of platform-led, not much opportunity for delegates to do things. But on the other hand, the sense that you want all the delegates in the hall. And certainly the Conservatives as operated in the last, say, 20 years, they don't really expect the delegates to be in the hall. They expect the delegates to be there, and especially, paying delegates and commercial delegates, but they don't necessarily expect you to be all in the same place. Now, Reform, that's what they did this year, and it'll be interesting to see how, if the Reform Party continues to grow, how their conference grows with it. But I think really what you're getting at is that each of the political parties has an expectation amongst its membership that conference will run in a particular way.
Yep.
And that sort of inertia makes it very difficult for a political party to turn around and say, well, actually, no, we're going to do it this way this year.
Yep. So they're very much here to stay, I think. Well, thank you very much. And that's all for us this time. But don't forget to tune in next time for more updates.